November 13, 1942. 2 hours past midnight. The waters off Guadalcanal. The darkness was absolute. No moon. No stars. Only the sound of waves slapping against steel hulls, and the low hum of diesel engines cutting through the tropical night. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe stood on the bridge of the battleship high, his white gloves gripping the railing as salt spray misted his face. Around him, 13 warships moved in disciplined formation through the Iron-Bottom Sound, their massive guns trained toward the darkness, where American positions lay hidden on the island's beaches. The Admiral's orders were clear: bombard Henderson Field, destroy the American airstrip, secure Japanese control of the Solomon Islands. His men had trained for night combat. They had practiced in these conditions. They had perfected the art of naval warfare in darkness, using superior optics, flares, and the keen eyes of lookouts, who had spent years learning to distinguish shadow from substance on moonless waters. They were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to Tsushima, to victories won when vision and discipline triumphed over chaos. But on this night, something had changed. Something the Admiral could not yet see, could not yet comprehend, was already watching him. 40 miles away, aboard the American cruiser Helena, a young radar operator named Robert Billy sat before a glowing screen in a darkened compartment. Green phosphorescent blips pulsed across the circular display, each one representing a Japanese warship moving through waters the enemy believed were theirs alone. Billy called out bearings and ranges with mechanical precision. The numbers meant something now. They meant the Americans could see in the dark. They meant that the ancient advantage of the night fighter, the careful positioning, the patient approach, all of it, had become obsolete in a single technological leap. The Battle of Guadalcanal was about to begin, and for the first time in naval history, one side would fight blind while the other possessed something approaching omniscience. The Japanese did not know they had already lost the element of surprise. They did not know that radar, a word most of their officers could barely pronounce, had rendered their careful night approach as visible as a daylight parade. They did not know that in the span of a single war, the entire calculus of naval combat had shifted beneath their feet like sand giving way to the tide. This is the story of how technology shattered confidence, how invisible waves rewrote the rules of the sea, and how the finest naval officers in the Pacific discovered that all their training, all their tradition, all their discipline meant nothing against an enemy who could see through the darkness itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Second World War with legitimate reasons for confidence. Their night-fighting capabilities were unmatched. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized the decisive night engagement, the moment when superior training and equipment would allow their forces to close with the enemy under cover of darkness and deliver a catastrophic blow before dawn revealed the true disposition of forces. Their optical equipment was extraordinary. The Japanese had developed night binoculars with larger objective lenses than anything the Americans possessed in the war's early years. Their lookouts underwent rigorous training, spending hours in darkened rooms learning to distinguish minute variations in shadow and light. They practiced identifying ship silhouettes at extreme ranges, memorizing the profiles of every American and British warship likely to be encountered. During exercises, Japanese destroyers routinely detected targets at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards using nothing but human eyes and finely crafted glass. More than equipment, they possessed the long-lance torpedo, the Type 93, a weapon that remained secret from Western intelligence until well into the war. These oxygen-fueled torpedoes could travel more than 20 miles at 48 knots, carrying a warhead of over 1,000 pounds. American torpedoes of 1942 struggled to reach half that range and frequently malfunctioned, running too deep or failing to detonate. The long lance gave Japanese destroyers and cruisers a standoff capability that seemed almost supernatural to American commanders, who watched their ships explode from torpedoes launched from beyond visual range. In night actions off Java, off Savo Island, in the narrow waters of the Solomons, Japanese forces had demonstrated time and again that they owned the darkness. American losses in those early engagements were staggering. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged 2 others in less than an hour, suffering only light damage in return. It was a massacre enabled by night, by training, by tradition. Japanese officers studied the classics of naval warfare with religious devotion. They read Mahan and Corbett, but they also absorbed the lessons of their own history. The night action at Tsushima Strait in 1905, where Admiral Togo's forces had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet through superior positioning and gunnery. They understood that naval combat was as much about psychology as firepower, that the side which could impose its will on the geometry of battle would usually prevail. Control the engagement range, control the bearing, control the timing of the first salvo, and victory would follow. Night combat multiplied these advantages. An enemy who could not see could not respond effectively. An enemy who relied on visual spotting would always be seconds behind, always reacting rather than initiating. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire tactical doctrine around this principle, and for the first year of the Pacific War, it had worked brilliantly. But none of this doctrine accounted for radar. None of the training, none of the equipment, none of the tradition prepared Japanese officers for the reality that their opponents might possess a means of detection that rendered darkness irrelevant. The technology itself was not new. Scientists in multiple countries had experimented with radio detection systems throughout the 1930s. The British had developed Chain Home, the radar network that provided crucial early warning during the Battle of Britain. The Germans had their own radar systems, primitive but functional. The Americans had been working on naval fire control radar since the late 1930s, driven by a recognition that future naval battles might be decided by whoever could strike first from beyond visual range. By 1942, American cruisers and destroyers were being fitted with increasingly sophisticated radar sets. The SG surface search radar could detect ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles, while the Mark 37 fire control director allowed guns to be aimed with precision at targets the human eye could not yet perceive. The Japanese were aware that such technology existed. Their intelligence services had reported on radar development in Britain and America. But awareness is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as belief. Japanese naval officers had been trained to trust their eyes, their instincts, their hard-won experience reading the sea. The idea that an electronic device could outperform human skills seemed almost insulting. Even when reports filtered back from early engagements suggesting that American ships were detecting Japanese forces at impossible ranges, many commanders dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or attributed them to luck, to chance sightings by aircraft, to anything but the systematic advantage that radar actually provided. This cognitive resistance was not mere stubbornness. It reflected a deeper cultural investment in the value of human training and discipline. The Japanese military ethos emphasized the spiritual and moral dimensions of warfare. Victory belonged to those with superior will, superior dedication, superior character. Technology was a tool, but it was not a replacement for the warrior spirit. A radar screen could not substitute for years of training, for the accumulated wisdom of experienced officers, for the ineffable quality that distinguished a true naval commander from a mere technician. This belief was not unique to Japan. Every military culture struggles with the tension between tradition and innovation, but it created a particular blindness within the Imperial Japanese Navy, a blindness that would cost them dearly in the battles to come. Admiral Abe's force approached Guadalcanal that November night confident in their mission. They had executed similar bombardment runs before. They knew the Americans had ships in the area. Reconnaissance had spotted destroyers and cruisers near Lunga Point. But the Japanese force was stronger, better coordinated, more experienced in night action. Abe's flagship, the High, was a battleship, a capital ship with 14-inch guns capable of hurling shells the size of small automobiles. Even if American forces attempted to interfere, the sheer firepower advantage would be decisive. The plan was simple: approach under cover of darkness, open fire on Henderson Field at close range, saturate the airstrip with high explosive shells, and withdraw before American aircraft could launch at dawn. It was a plan that had worked before. It should have worked again. But at 0124 hours, the American task force commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan received radar contact. The range was 27,000 yards, over 13 miles. The Japanese ships appeared on the Helena's radar screen as distinct targets, their courses and speeds calculated with mechanical precision. Callahan's force consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, outnumbered and outgunned by the Japanese battleship and its escorts. In a traditional night engagement, the Americans would have been at a severe disadvantage, forced to wait until visual contact before opening fire, always reacting to Japanese initiative. But radar changed everything. Callahan knew exactly where the enemy was, exactly how fast they were approaching, exactly what bearing they were on. He could position his forces, plan his attack, prepare his guns, all while the Japanese still believed they were undetected. The two forces closed rapidly. Japanese lookouts strained their eyes toward the darkness, searching for the telltale silhouette of American ships. They saw nothing. The Americans, meanwhile, tracked every movement on their radar screens, calling out ranges and bearings, training their guns toward targets they could not yet see with the naked eye. At a range of 3,000 yards, point blank in naval terms, the Japanese finally spotted the American column. Flares shot into the sky, harsh magnesium light burning away the darkness. For a moment, both sides could see each other clearly, ships illuminated in the artificial dawn of battlefield pyrotechnics. Then the guns opened fire, and the night dissolved into chaos. The engagement that followed was brutal, confused, ships firing at close range in a melee that resembled a knife fight more than a traditional naval battle. The High took dozens of hits from American destroyers and cruisers that closed to suicidal range, their guns hammering the battleship's superstructure. The destroyer Laffey passed so close to the High that American sailors could see Japanese crewmen on the battleship's deck before the destroyer was blown apart by point-blank fire. Both sides suffered terrible casualties. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Callahan himself was killed when a Japanese shell struck his flagship's bridge. But when dawn broke, the High was crippled, her steering damaged, her superstructure a wreck, dead in the water, and vulnerable to American aircraft that swarmed from Henderson Field like hornets from a disturbed nest. By sunset on November 13th, the battleship was sinking, the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. The tactical details of the battle mattered less than the strategic revelation. The Japanese had been detected at a range and under conditions that should have made detection impossible. Their careful approach, their night fighting expertise, their superior optics, none of it had mattered. The Americans had seen them coming from miles away, had tracked their movements, had prepared their response. Japanese officers who survived the engagement returned to their superiors with disturbing reports. The enemy had known their position with impossible accuracy. The enemy had fired with uncanny precision in conditions of near-total darkness. Something fundamental had changed in the nature of naval warfare, and the Japanese were only beginning to grasp the implications. In the month that followed, the pattern repeated. At the Battle of Cape St. George in November 1943, American destroyers used radar to ambush a Japanese supply convoy, sinking 3 destroyers without loss. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, radar-directed American cruisers engaged Japanese forces at night and emerged victorious despite being outnumbered. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American fighters directed by radar shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft while suffering minimal losses themselves. The technological advantage was comprehensive, extending from surface combat to air defense, from fire control to navigation. And with each engagement, the psychological impact deepened. Japanese naval officers were not fools. They recognized that they were facing a fundamental disadvantage. After-action reports from surviving commanders repeatedly mentioned the enemy's uncanny ability to detect Japanese forces at extreme ranges and in conditions of poor visibility. Intelligence officers compiled these reports, analyzed the patterns, and concluded that the Americans possessed some form of electronic detection equipment far superior to anything Japan had developed. Efforts were made to capture this technology, to reverse engineer it, to develop countermeasures. But these efforts came too late, and with too few resources. Japan's industrial base was already straining under the demands of a multi-front war. The raw materials needed for advanced electronics, high-quality copper, specialized vacuum tubes, precision components, were in short supply. Even more critically, Japan lacked the scientific infrastructure to rapidly iterate and improve radar technology the way American and British laboratories were doing. By 1943, American radar sets were being produced in mass quantities, with continuous improvements in range, resolution, and reliability. Japanese radar development, by contrast, remained fragmentary, under-resourced, and hampered by inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy. The psychological effect on Japanese naval officers was profound and demoralizing. These were men who had spent their entire careers mastering the art of naval warfare as it had been practiced for centuries. They had trained exhaustively, studied historical examples, developed tactics based on careful analysis of engagement geometry and ship capabilities. They had entered the war confident that their skills and discipline would compensate for any material disadvantages they might face. And now they discovered that all of that expertise had been rendered largely obsolete by a technology they barely understood and could not replicate. It was as if the rules of the game had been changed mid-match without their knowledge or consent. One captured Japanese naval officer. This is where the symbolic weight of radar becomes fully apparent. It was not merely a piece of equipment. It was a physical manifestation of a different approach to warfare, a different approach to society itself. American radar represented the triumph of industrial mass production, of scientific research, of the capacity to translate theoretical knowledge into practical advantage on a massive scale. It represented a system in which engineers and scientists were as important as soldiers and sailors, in which innovation was systematized rather than left to individual genius, in which victory could be engineered through superior logistics and manufacturing capacity. The Japanese military ethos had emphasized individual warrior spirit, hierarchical discipline, and the moral superiority that came from enduring hardship. The American approach, at least as it appeared through the lens of radar, emphasized collective effort, technological solutions, and the systematic application of material advantage. These were not just different tactics. They were different philosophies of how to organize society and wage war. And the Americans had one other advantage that radar made devastatingly clear: abundance. The sheer quantity of radar sets produced by American industry was staggering. By 1944, virtually every American cruiser, destroyer, and even many smaller vessels were equipped with multiple radar systems: surface search, air search, fire control. This redundancy meant that even if one system failed, others could compensate. It meant that American task forces operated with overlapping coverage, multiple ships tracking the same targets, cross-referencing data, building a comprehensive picture of the battlefield that no individual ship could create alone. Japanese forces, by contrast, operated with minimal electronic support. Even when they managed to deploy radar-equipped ships, these systems were often unreliable, their operators poorly trained, the technology itself inferior to American equivalents. The gap widened with each passing month. The material abundance that radar symbolized extended far beyond electronics. Japanese sailors and officers who were captured or who observed American facilities after the war expressed consistent astonishment at the sheer quantity of resources available to American forces. American supply ships carried not just ammunition and fuel but refrigerated food, ice cream machines, washing machines, recreational equipment. American naval bases in the Pacific were constructed with a speed and scale that seemed incomprehensible to Japanese observers accustomed to scarcity. American aircraft carriers damaged in battle were repaired in weeks and returned to service. Japanese carriers damaged to a similar degree might languish in port for months waiting for parts and skilled labor that no longer existed. This was the reality of total war between an industrial superpower operating at peak capacity and an island nation stretched to the breaking point. The radar screen itself became a kind of window into this disparity. When American radar operators watched their screens, they saw an ordered, comprehensible battlefield, contacts identified, tracks maintained, threats assessed. The screen represented control, predictability, the ability to plan and execute with confidence. For Japanese officers, who later examined captured American radar equipment, the screens must have seemed almost magical, an impossible clarity extracted from chaos. But that clarity was not magic. It was the product of thousands of engineers working in laboratories, of factories producing components to precise specifications, of supply chains that could deliver replacement parts anywhere in the Pacific within days, of a society organized around the principle that problems could be solved through systematic application of resources and knowledge. By 1944, the disparity had become so obvious that some Japanese commanders began to alter their tactics in ways that acknowledged their technological inferiority. Rather than seek decisive night engagements where radar would give the Americans an insurmountable advantage, Japanese forces increasingly relied on dispersed submarine warfare, on hit-and-run attacks, on defensive positions that made use of terrain rather than open water maneuver. These were the tactics of a force that knew it could not win on the enemy's terms, and was searching desperately for alternative approaches. But even these adjustments could not overcome the fundamental imbalance. American submarines, also equipped with radar, hunted Japanese merchant shipping with devastating effectiveness, sinking over half the Japanese merchant fleet by war's end. American aircraft, directed by radar-equipped controllers, intercepted Japanese air strikes before they could reach their targets. The technology's advantages multiplied across every dimension of naval warfare. There is a specific quality to the Japanese naval officers' disillusionment that deserves examination. These were not men prone to self-pity or defeatism. They were products of an intensely demanding military education, trained to view hardship as a test of character, to accept sacrifice as the natural cost of service. Many had experienced victory in the early war years, had seen their tactics and training produce tangible results, had led their men through successful engagements that confirmed everything they had been taught. The shock of discovering that none of it mattered against radar was not just tactical, it was existential. It called into question the entire framework through which they understood their profession and their purpose. Consider the position of a destroyer captain, a man who might have spent 20 years in the Navy, who had risen through the ranks on the strength of his navigation skills, his ability to read weather and sea conditions, his tactical judgment in close-quarters combat. Such a man would have internalized the belief that experience and skill were the ultimate arbiters of naval competence. He would have trained his lookouts relentlessly, drilled his crew in night-fighting procedures, studied his charts and intelligence reports with meticulous care. And then, in battle, he would discover that an American ship with half his experience and a fraction of his training could detect his vessel from beyond the horizon, could track his movements, could fire accurately at his position while he still groped in the darkness. The technological advantage negated his expertise. It rendered his years of accumulated knowledge largely irrelevant. This was not the kind of defeat that could be accepted and learned from. It was a defeat that undermined the very basis of professional identity. American intelligence officers who interrogated Japanese prisoners noted this psychological dimension repeatedly. Many captured officers expressed a kind of bewildered respect for American technology, a recognition that they had been defeated not by better sailors or braver men, but by superior tools. Some described feeling as though they had brought swords to a gunfight, as though the war they had prepared for was not the war they were actually fighting. This sense of displacement, of having been rendered obsolete by forces beyond individual control, created a distinctive kind of demoralization. It was possible to maintain morale in the face of setbacks, to endure losses and casualties, if one believed that dedication and effort could still make a difference. But when the gap was technological, when the advantage was baked into the equipment itself, then individual heroism seemed futile. What could a lookout's keen eyes accomplish when the enemy could see through the darkness itself? What value did tactical brilliance have when the enemy knew your position before you knew his? The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 crystallized these themes with brutal clarity. The Japanese had assembled a carrier strike force intended to deliver a decisive blow to the American invasion fleet off Saipan. They launched massive air strikes, over 400 aircraft, in waves designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. But American radar detected the incoming strikes while they were still over 100 miles away. Fighter directors vectored defending aircraft to intercept the Japanese formations long before they reached the American fleet. The result was catastrophic for Japan. American fighters, guided to their targets by radar, shot down approximately 350 Japanese aircraft in a single day. American losses numbered less than 30. Japanese pilots, many of them poorly trained replacements for the veterans lost in earlier battles, flew into a killing zone they never saw coming. The radar screens aboard American ships displayed the slaughter in abstract terms, contacts appearing, converging, then blinking out as aircraft fell burning into the sea. For the Americans? And yet, even in the face of this overwhelming disadvantage, Japanese naval officers continued to fight. This is perhaps the most complex aspect of the story. The recognition of technological inferiority did not immediately translate into surrender or collapse. Many officers internalized the disparity and continued to execute their duties with the same dedication they had shown in the war's early years. They adapted tactics where possible, accepted higher losses as inevitable, and continued to press attacks even when the odds were hopeless. This was partly a function of military culture, the ingrained discipline that demanded obedience regardless of circumstances. But it was also something deeper, a belief that surrender was unthinkable, that the fight itself had intrinsic value regardless of outcome, that to give up would dishonor all those who had already sacrificed. This created a tragic dimension to the war's final year. American forces, equipped with comprehensive radar coverage, could see Japanese kamikaze attacks forming up long before they arrived. They could vector fighters to intercept, coordinate defensive fire, maneuver to avoid the attackers. The kamikaze pilots, many of them volunteers, who believed their sacrifice would turn the tide of the war, flew missions that radar had rendered largely futile before they even began. Some attacks got through. Radar was not perfect, and human courage could sometimes overcome technological advantage. But the overall effectiveness was far lower than Japanese planners hoped. The attackers were not dying in vain, exactly, but they were dying against an enemy whose ability to detect and respond to threats had evolved far beyond what Japanese doctrine anticipated. It was a grinding, asymmetric kind of warfare in which the technologically superior side could see almost everything, while the inferior side fought half-blind, hoping that sheer determination might somehow balance the scales. The symbolic resonance of the radar screen as a representation of American power and abundance cannot be overstated. In an era before computers became ubiquitous, the radar screen was one of the first widely deployed instances of electronic information display, a glowing window that transformed invisible radio reflections into actionable intelligence. For sailors trained in traditional navigation and visual observation, the screens must have seemed almost like science fiction, a glimpse of a future in which machines augmented human senses in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The fact that these screens were manufactured by the tens of thousands, installed across the entire American fleet, continuously improved and upgraded, this spoke to an industrial and scientific capacity that Japan simply could not match. There is a particular irony in the Japanese Navy's predicament. They had entered the war believing that superior training and moral discipline could compensate for material disadvantages. This belief was not entirely wrong. In the early months of the war, Japanese forces did achieve victories against materially superior opponents through better tactics and more experienced crews. But the nature of modern industrial warfare meant that initial advantages eroded over time. Experienced crews were killed and replaced by less trained personnel. Equipment wore out and could not be adequately repaired or replaced. The enemy, meanwhile, learned from early defeats, adapted tactics, and brought its industrial capacity to bear in ways that multiplied advantage over time. Radar was both cause and symbol of this process. It represented the ability of a wealthy, industrialized society to translate scientific knowledge into mass-produced military advantage faster than a resource-constrained opponent could respond. By late 1944, many Japanese naval officers privately acknowledged that the war was lost. Intelligence reports, combat accounts, and simple mathematics made the conclusion inescapable. But acknowledging reality did not change their orders or their duty. They continued to plan operations, to lead their men into battle, to execute missions that they understood were likely suicidal. The radar disadvantage was now simply one more entry on a long list of systemic problems: fuel shortages, inadequate air cover, obsolete aircraft, poor training for replacement crews, collapsing logistics. The comprehensive nature of the disadvantages made it almost easier to accept. If everything was inadequate, then the radar gap was just part of a larger pattern, not a singular humiliation. The war's end brought a reckoning. Japanese officers who survived to see the surrender had to process not just military defeat, but the collapse of the worldview that had sustained them. The post-war period forced a confrontation with questions that the war had raised but left unanswered. What did it mean that technological superiority had trumped individual valor? What did it say about Japanese society that it had failed to match American industrial and scientific capacity? How could the values of discipline, sacrifice, and dedication that the military had emphasized be reconciled with a defeat so comprehensive that it extended across every dimension of warfare? These were not just military questions. They were cultural and philosophical ones that would shape Japan's reconstruction and its relationship with modernity in the decades to come. From the American perspective, radar was a success story of scientific research, industrial production, and systematic innovation. It demonstrated that a democratic society with a robust scientific establishment could out-innovate and outproduce an authoritarian rival. It validated the decision to invest heavily in research and development, to prioritize education and expertise, to create institutional structures that could translate theoretical advances into practical military advantage. The scientists and engineers who developed radar were celebrated after the war, their contributions recognized as being as important to victory as the efforts of frontline combat forces. This recognition marked a shift in how modern warfare was understood, not just as a contest of individual courage and tactical skill, but as a comprehensive test of national capacity across all domains. But there is a melancholy undercurrent to this narrative as well. The Japanese officers who confronted the radar advantage were not villains or fools. They were professional military men who had dedicated their lives to mastering their craft, who had been taught that excellence could be achieved through discipline and effort, who believed that the human element remained paramount even in mechanized warfare. The discovery that technology could negate decades of training, that machines could outperform human senses, that industrial capacity mattered more than individual skill, these revelations did not just affect combat outcomes. They raised fundamental questions about the value of human expertise in an age of rapidly advancing technology. These questions remain relevant today, as automation and artificial intelligence increasingly encroach on domains that were once considered the exclusive preserve of human judgment and skill. The radar screen, glowing softly in the darkness of a ship's combat information center, represented a threshold that warfare had crossed. Before radar, naval combat retained elements of the pre-industrial age, the importance of keen eyesight, the skill of experienced navigators, the art of reading weather and sea conditions. After radar, naval warfare became increasingly abstract, a contest fought on electronic displays rather than observed directly. The human element did not disappear, but it was mediated through technology in ways that changed its nature. A radar operator staring at a screen was exercising a kind of skill, but it was a different skill from that of a lookout scanning the horizon. The operator was interpreting electronic data, identifying patterns, making judgments based on training in reading displays rather than reading the sea itself. This shift from direct observation to mediated information was one of the defining transformations of 20th century warfare, and radar was its most visible emblem. For the Japanese naval officers who lived through this transformation, the experience must have been profoundly disorienting. They had entered the war as part of an elite, confident in their training and their nation's naval tradition. They ended the war having witnessed the systematic dismantling of everything that tradition represented. The lessons they had absorbed, the skills they had honed, the tactical principles they had mastered, all of it had been rendered obsolete by an enemy who fought with different tools and different principles. This was not the kind of defeat that could be rationalized as the result